Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Hi. All right, let's continue to discuss this very amazing process, the money creation process. Right? For me, this process is so amazing. You see, not just the government can create money, banks can also create money through making loans. All right, so let me give you a brief review about how this happens. Let's start with this slide. Right, for money to create money, we need to look at this fractional reserve banking system. That is to say, banks need to hold some money, some cash at banks, cannot loan out all deposits banks receive. And also to create this money creation process, we need two important assumptions to make things simple. All right, the first one is no cash drain. That means people in this economy, they deposit all currencies. All cash will be deposited at banks. That's the first assumption. And the second one is banks under this system will not hold excess reserves. All right, that's the beginning. Here, after you are familiar with this process, these two assumptions can be relaxed. Right, so remember the example we had last week is initially people have $100, okay, as cash, and then they just deposit. The first step of this process is people just deposit this $100 at First National Bank, right? And also one more concept to review is see here this capital R stands for required ratio. This is required by the central bank. And here we are using the Fed, the central bank in the US. Central bank, you can think it as the bank of the regular banks, right? So the central bank here requires the regular bank to hold 10% of the deposit to be reserves. All right, so based on this required reserve ratio, you see the deposits here is $100 initially, and the bank here needs to keep 10% of this $100, which is $10 at banks, cannot be loaned out. This $10, whatever left here can be loaned out. So we have these two numbers, reserves for the first steps. For the first step, reserves here is $10 loans equal to $90. And then, all right, based on this procedure, just after the first step, the money supply now will be 190. Why? Remember the definition of money supply. Please look at here. The money supply is equal to C plus D. C, that's the currency. D, that's the deposit. Now, after the first step here, you see the currency here now is $90. Where does it come from? Right, this $90 here is the loans. Remember here, the First National Bank just loans out $90 of the initial $100 deposits. So now the borrowers here hold these $90 as cash. So that's the currency, that's the cash. And deposits, right? Remember we have $100 in deposits. Therefore, the money supply after the first step here is 190, comparing to the initial status. Initially, we have $100 in currency at zero deposits. So the money supply initially is equal to 100. Comparing these two numbers, you see, excuse me, let me just, you see through the first step here, Money supply increases by $90. Try to observe that the loans for the first step is $90. So you see here, the increase in money supply for this step is exactly equal to the number of loans. So that's for the first step. Here, then the process can continue. And then the borrowers of the first, from the First National Bank can deposit this $90 cash to the Second National Bank. You see, we just follow the same logic. The deposits now is $90, and based on the required reserve ratio, 10%. So $9 need to be held at the bank. And what's left here, $81 can be loaned out. And for the third step, here again, now the new deposit at the Third National Bank is equal to 81. That's a loan from the Second National Bank, right? Therefore, for the third step here, the reserve, the number of reserve here, 81 times 10%, 8.1. And whatever left here, that's the new loans can be made by the Third National Bank. Therefore, to see if the process continues, let's try to see what happens to the deposits. You see, the original deposits is $100. And for the First National Bank, the deposits here, the loans, the cash is $90. For the second, 81. So we can just looking at this process. So let me start with. So we need to see what is the total money after process is completed. Let's try to see. We just do the math. All right, for the original, we have $100. And then for the first step, the bank can make $90 out of the original 100 deposits. So this 90 comes from, remember the required reserve ratio. Let me put it here. It's 10%. So I can put it like this. And for the second step, that will be times, all right, to the infinity. So I can put down right based on the math formula we know. If we want to know what happens to the final money supply, that will be equal to this one. Or I'm trying to show how we get to this number here. So after the process is completed, then the total money supply will be equal to $1,000. That is to say, based on the original deposit, $100, in the end, through this process, the total number of money supply will be equal to $1,000. So let me just elaborate this process. So let me just give you a summary, or just you can think it as a quick review again. All right, to talk about the basic situation of money creation process. Based on our discussion, we just assume there is only one banking system, or you can regard it as just one bank, and no cash drain. People deposit all currency, and also bank here holds no excess reserves. Then let's just use the same required reserve ratio. All right, that's the amount of reserves against the original deposits required by the Fed. Say, right, I'm lucky, I won 1,000. I won with 1,000 lottery. Then I just deposit this $1,000. Lucky money. In the bank. And then based on this required reserve ratio, the bank needs to keep 10% of this $1,000, that's 100, as reserves. And the rest, $900, can be the loan, right? And then we just, again, assume the borrower here. Let me just randomly name a person. Say Ellen borrowed $900 from this bank. And Ellen just used this amount to buy an iPhone. Oh, can you see that? iPhone. Say from Chelsea. Now you see the $900 was at Chelsea's hand. Then Chelsea just deposit. This $900 at bank. So actually you can do the math, right? Very simple. I'm just trying to get you familiar with this process. So this should be, oh, sorry. Should be 810. Now just based on these two steps, let's try to see. Before we look at, sorry. Right, before we look at the total amount of money supply, let's try to look at this number. Oh. if we want to know what is the total deposits for these two steps of money creation process, total deposits. So let's try to check. All right, deposit, all right, initial deposit, $1,000, and then Chelsea deposited 900. Therefore, the total deposits here, I can write that it comes from the sum of 1,000 and 900. Then what about the total reserves? Oh, okay. Let me highlight this one in yellow. Total reserves. We use green to show the reserves. So see reserve 190 for the two steps here. Then we just add them together. 100 plus 90. So based on this, we can get, you see, reserves. Total reserves 190 and the total deposits 1,900. So just try to make sure. See here, the required reserve ratio is 10%. Right? Just try to decompose deposits and the reserve from the process. Okay, and then let's try to see, try to look at what happens to the total money supply. Okay, I'm going to. All right, again, I need to write something. Ooh. So let's see, remember the money supply is equal to C plus D. Keep this in mind. And let's look at the money creation process. All right, let me repeat. No cash drain. You see, I have mentioned these two assumptions at least 3 times just today. No excess reserves. Now let's change the number for required reserve ratio. Let's raise it to, say, 20%. And then do the same thing. Initial cash, $1,000. Say, the first money holder here deposit into the bank. And then the bank, based on this ratio, needs to keep, or 20% of 1,000, that's 200. So the loans, here is $800. And then out of these $800 loans, the borrower here can again deposit this $800 at the bank. So the reserve now should be 800 times 20%. So that's 160. And the loans here should be 640. Right, let me just write it down. Ooh. Sorry. Let's see. Thank you. For these $640 loans, again, the borrowers here can deposit. Now you don't need me to make the calculations for you, right? But the thing here is, you see, for the total money supply, remember the target of these parties. We want to know what is the final money supply after the entire process completes. So money supply comes from the original deposits, and then 800 and 640. So it is equal to, based on the formula, wow, after the process, the money supply is now 5,000, and the initial money supply here just the $1,000 in cash. So based on this, you know, by making loans, the banking system here we just make it simple. Just try to consider only one bank. Actually, first bank, second bank will do the job. However, here, based on this, you see the original deposit is equal to 1,000, and the final amount of money supply is equal to $5,000. That means the money supply is 5 times after the process completes. So based on this, we can introduce this terminology, very important, money multiplier. So let's look at the official definition of money multiplier first. All right, money multiplier means that's the amount of money the banking system can generate with each dollar of reserves. Right, for me, it just means how much money the banking system can create by each dollar of its deposits. So $1 deposit at the bank, in the end, how much money the bank can create, this number, that's the money multiplier. Of course, the greater the multiplier, the greater money the bank can create. So what will determine the size of this multiplier? Right, as smart as you. Based on the math formula, you must have observed that whenever we do the calculation for the final amount of money supply after the process ends, it is always related to the reserve ratio. So here, money multiplier is just the reciprocal of reserve ratio, the inverse of the reserve ratio. So if the reserve ratio is 10%, then the multiplier is 10. And of course, if 20%, if the required reserve ratio is equal to 20%, then the money multiplier will be equal to 5. And please keep in mind here, let me just go back to, oops. So apparently you can see that is an inverse relationship. I can put it this way. They are negatively related. Okay, the bigger the required reserve ratio, the smaller the money multiplier. That means the fewer, okay, let me rephrase. The bigger the required reserve ratio, the smaller the money multiplier. It means based on this bigger required reserve ratio, the bank can create smaller amount of money. Why? Because when the required reserve ratio is bigger, bank can just make fewer and fewer loans. Therefore, the total money supply will be smaller when the required reserve ratio gets bigger and bigger. And one more thing I need to mention here. All right? So for this numerical example, based on the original deposit, $100 together with the required reserve ratio, we know after the creation process ends, the total money supply will be equal to $1,000. Please keep in mind, this $1,000 includes the initial deposits, which is $100. Okay, that is to say, if the question becomes, all right, we are interested how this money creation process affects the money supply. In other words, we are interested in the change in the money supply. You see the initial money supply is equal to 100, and the new money supply is 1,000. Therefore, based on this, we can say the increase in money supply in this situation is equal to 900. That's the change in money supply. All right, then we can begin to look at some practice. So please take 1 minute to read the question.
So can you show the previous slides because I missed this one?
Previous, all right. Ooh.
Thank you.
All right, no problem. Then let's continue with this practice problem. Try to clarify some concepts in this question. Where no excess reserves and the required reserve ratio is 5%. Now the bank receives a new deposit. Be careful about the statement. We have a new deposit, $1,000. All right, then what happens? This bank will increase its required reserves by $50. Very straightforward, right? It comes from here. Yeah, so A is correct. Right, B, this bank will initially see its total reserves increase by $1,000. Right? This is a little bit tricky. Okay, later I will explain B is correct or not. Let's go to C first. C, this bank will be able to make a new loan of $950, of course. If A is correct, then C must be correct. Okay, 950. How about B? Of course, during the exam, if you are so sure A and C are correct, you are not so sure about B. But look at what choice you can have. D, all of the above are correct. So apparently you need to choose D. But how come B is correct? Let's try to think. Here, initially, the keyword here is initially. You can think it. Once the bank receives this new deposit, before, it means before the bank loan out. Oh, sorry. Before, I need to use the green. Before loan out the deposits, everything in the bank is reserves. Or you can say currency stays in the bank. That's reserves. So initially, when the bank just received this new deposit, $1,000, we can say the reserves initially go up by $1,000. So the answer for this one is D. Or maybe I should just put down something like this. Okay? So try to make the concepts clear. And then we can try to do some calculations, of course, regarding the money creation process. All right, let's look at this practice problem. All right, the story goes, all right, while cleaning your apartment, okay, you just found a $50 bill under the sofa cushion. Then you deposit this $50 in your checking account. And also we have this information. Now the required reserve ratio is 20%. So ABC, A is about what is the maximum amount of loan this bank can make at step 1 of the creation process. And B, all right, what is the total increase in deposit? So of course you need to find the maximum amount of deposit. And C, what is the minimum amount of money supply? Or C is straightforward. So let's try to see for the first one, what is the maximum amount of loan at step 1 of the money creation process? Initial deposit is equal to 50 and the required reserve ratio is 20%. So directly you can know the bank needs to keep 20% of this $50 as reserves. Then the left can be loaned out. So the maximum amount of loans at step 1 this bank can make is equal to $40. Right? And for B, what is the maximum amount of deposit this banking system could generate? So talking about the maximum amount, that's the simplest situation as we discussed. So no cash stream and no excess reserve. Therefore, for this one, the money multiplier is the reciprocal of required reserve ratio. So here, 20%, here, 20%. So the money multiplier is equal to 5, and the original deposit is equal to 50. So we put these two things together, we know the maximum amount, the maximum amount of deposit can be generated by this process is 250. Right? And here again, I'm trying to remind you this part. If we just switch here the deposit to money supply, so the maximum possible amount in money supply can be created by this banking system will be equal to, here, you need to exclude the initial $50 because this initial $50 is not created by the banking system. That's the original. okay, not created by this process. So the increase in money supply here should be $200. Okay, I think the concept here is straightforward. And then for part C, the most straightforward one, what is the minimum amount? Remember the process here, why the banks can create money? Because banks can make loans. So for the minimum amount that money supply could increase, when banks make no loans, then no money is created. Okay, you deposit $50 at the bank, then bank just hold this $50. Therefore, the money multiplier here will be equal to 1 if the bank holds the entire deposit as reserves. Okay, no money is created. Ooh. And let's look at. All right, so based on this question, you see, this economy starts with $10,000 in currency. And all of this currency is deposited into this bank. And then the bank makes a loan equal to 9,250. So here, I have already provided the T account here of this bank. On the right-hand side, that's the liabilities. So the deposits here, $10,000. On the left-hand side, that's the assets, the sum of reserves and the loans. Then let's see. The first question here, the bank operates under a, you see, fractional reserve banking system. So the first one, oh, sorry, totally full question. Fractional banking system. Okay, how much is the bank's reserve ratio? Again, direct calculation. So the reserves, the ratio of reserves to the deposits, that's the reserve ratio. So here, 750 over 10,000. Assuming all banks in this economy have the same reserve ratio, then what is the money multiplier? Just, oops. Oh, sorry. The reciprocal of this reserve ratio. Okay, it's not an integer, 13.33. Right, the last one, just try to read the question. All right, even though I have already shown you the answer, but just try to think it through. An increase in reserves of 150 for this bank has the potential to increase the deposits for the bank by how much? In other words, this question is asking you how much deposit required to have the 150 increase in reserves. Again, straightforward calculation. We know the reserve ratio is here, 7.5%. So based on this ratio, we know in the question, it requires that the reserves here go up by 150. So what deposit, how much deposit we need to have a 150 increase in reserves? So the answer is 2,000. Right, so actually you can see for all these practice problems, this, as long as you are clear about the concept, the calculations are straightforward. All right, then let's look at the next one. A similar story as previous practice. Again, you found accidentally you found this $100. Then you deposit this $100 in the banking system. And the information here, the reserve ratio, here is 10%. So question number 1, how much does the total amount of deposits? The initial deposit is 100. The second question, all right, but how much does the money supply increase based on this process? So let's try to see. Ooh, okay. By this question, I'm trying to give you a quick review. Right, money supply is equal to C plus D, currency plus deposits. So before this $100 is deposited, see currency 100, deposit 0. Totally, money supply is equal to 100. And then after this $100 is deposited, however, let's look at what happens before the bank makes any loans. Here, the money supply is equal to, remember, C plus D. Now, everything is deposited in bank. So 0 currency, but $100 in deposits. But the number of money supply stays the same before the bank makes any loans. Or just the decrease in currency is equal to the increase in deposit. So money supply here stays the same. Now the required reserve ratio is 10%. Therefore, the money multiplier is equal to 10. Then for the first question, the total amount of deposit in the banking system increases, including the initial $100 should be, see, the money multiplier is equal to 10. Okay. Multiplied by the initial deposit. Here we know the total amount of deposit through the entire money creation process here is $1,000. Okay, here again, a quick review. Initial deposit 100, and then based on the required reserve ratio, the second deposit 90, and then 81. All right, for part 2, how much does the money supply increase? Here, remember this reminder. Here we care about the change, the increase in money supply. So we need to remove the original $100 because the original $100 here is already in money supply. So when we talk about the change, the increase in money supply, here. This original $100 should be excluded. All right, so give me one. Ooh. Then let's look at this. We have this T account of a certain bank. Okay. Where you see the reserves on the left-hand side, reserves 2,000. The deposits, the liabilities 20,000. Therefore, must be fractional reserve banking system. And of course, reserves are less than deposits. So the answer for number one, the answer should be A. And then ratio, reserve ratio. Okay, straightforward. And number three, so no excess reserve and no cash strain. What is the money multiplier? B. Right. For part 4, if the Fed here just requires the ratio to be 9%. So what is the amount of excess reserves this bank holds? So you can do it like this. Right, based on the 9%, you see, the bank just needs to keep 1,800 as reserves. But now the reserves are equal to 2,000. So the difference here is 200. Therefore, the 200 here, that's the excess reserves. Maybe I should put down here. All right. So after we practice this problem, that's all practice for this money creation process. So our next section will be, remember, during the money creation process, all right, we always talk about the required reserve ratio. This ratio is required by the central bank in the economy. And also remember that the most important job of the central bank of the economy is try to control the money supply. So our next section will be the issue about how the central bank of the economy to control the money supply. So, okay. Then let's have our first break. And then after that break, we can begin to look at the policy instrument the central bank can use to control money supply. So let's come back at 3:15. All right, class. Let's begin to look at how the Fed, the central bank in US, all right? Actually, we just use the Fed as an example, right? So these policy instruments we will be talking about are mostly the same in most countries. So here, remember I mentioned that the most important job of the central bank in any economy is try to control the money supply, especially under the fractional reserve banking system. So the policy instruments here, there are totally 4. Here, so we will discuss these 4 policy instruments in detail, one by one. So the first one is open market operation. Let me change the color. Okay, open market. What market? Which market? This market refers to the market of bonds. Market. That means the Fed can buy or sell government bonds. Here, through this purchase or sale of government bonds, the Fed can control the money supply. See, if the policy target is to raise the money supply, so should the Fed buy or sell government bond? Okay, because this is the first time we talk about these open market operations. So let's try to show you what the Fed should do first. If the Fed intends to raise the money supply in the economy, the Fed can buy government bonds. So let me make it complete. Can buy the government bonds from the public. Okay, in this way, the Fed needs to pay the public with money, with cash. Then the public held as currency for the payment. The public held as currency. And then now you got the point why we need to go over the money creation process first before we talk about the policy instrument of the Fed. You see, based on this purchase of government bond, the Fed kind of brings the money to the public's hand. Then the public can just deposit this currency at banks. For each new dollar held as currency will raise the money supply by only $1 if the public did not deposit this currency. If the public deposited this currency at banks, then the money creation process begins. In this way, you see, when people deposited money in banks, and for each new dollar increase in deposit, here through the loans made by banks, the money supply will go up by more than just the initial $1. Let me just add one more point here. Actually, so you can say, deposit. That is to say, when the Fed buys government bonds in the bond market through money creation process, the money supply will go up. And of course, if the policy target is to reduce the money supply in the economy, then just sells government bonds to the public. In this way, the Fed takes currency and deposits from the public. Therefore, just the opposite of the money creation process. The money supply will be reduced. Right? So based on this is the first policy instrument the Fed can use to control money supply. Actually, this policy instrument is the one used most frequently among the four. Used most frequently. Why? Because it is easy to conduct this type of policy. Well, any day, the Fed can just try to buy or sell large or small amount of bonds based on the policy target. The thing here is just buy and sell government bonds in the bond market. No need to change the law or bank regulations. You see, this, in order to change the bank regulations, it may take a longer time to achieve this change. But for open market operations, you can say the effect here, we can just conduct this policy immediate. So this is the first policy instrument. And based on this, you will see for the rest, for the other three policy instruments, you see, it may involve in changes of bank regulations. I try to see. Or at the second policy instrument, the Fed can lend money to banks. It happens when the regular banks are running low on reserves, not enough reserves at banks. So the banks can borrow reserves from the Fed. You see, this is a debt for the regular bank. So as long as it is a debt, a loan, this is a loan made by the Fed. So the regular banks here need to pay the cost to borrow money from the Fed. And here we have important terminology. Of course, that's the interest rate, but the interest rate here are paid by regular banks to the Fed. The special term here, the discount rate. So that's the cost of borrowing from the Fed. Or the concept is the same as when people borrow money from regular banks, but here just the term is different. The discount rate refers to what regular banks pay to the Fed. All right, this is a policy instrument the Fed can use to control money supply. All right, how does it work? If the target is to raise money supply, that is to say, the Fed here can encourage regular banks to borrow money from the Fed and then make more loans. And then based on the money creation process, the money supply will increase. So to encourage regular banks to borrow money from the bank, the Fed need to lower the cost of such borrowing. Therefore, the Fed need to lower the cost of the borrowing. In other words, lower the discount rate. So a lower cost to borrow from the Fed, then the regular bank can borrow more and then make more loans. And together with the money creation process, then money supply will go up. And similarly, if the target is to reduce money supply, just do the opposite. Okay, the Fed just raised the discount rate, then the regular bank will borrow fewer than before. So just the opposite of the money creation process, then the money supply will go down. So the intuition is very straightforward, right? And for the third policy instrument, reserve ratio, right? So the Fed can also try to adjust the reserve ratio here. And of course, remember money multiplier here is equal to the inverse, the reciprocal of the reserve ratio. So the greater the reserve ratio, the smaller the money multiplier. Therefore, the money supply will go down because of this greater reserve ratio. So let's see how it works. Here, just try to give you the definition of reserve ratio. Again, that's a regulation, a minimum amount of reserves banks must hold against deposits. That's what this ratio means. So let's try to think. If the Fed intends to raise the money supply in the economy, right? The greater the ratio, then the bank needs to keep more money, and the bank cannot loan out as much as before. Therefore, the money supply will go down. Okay, I'm explaining the opposite situation. To raise the money supply, right, the Fed should just reduce the required reserve ratio. Since in this way, banks can make more loans. More money here the bank can use to make loans. Therefore, more loans. Here the money supply will go down. Or you can, so for this part, that's the intuition. Okay, you can think it through the definition of required reserves. Or you can think it from the formula. When we lower the required reserve ratio, the multiplier will go up. Then, of course, the money supply will go up. So this is just, we think from the formula. Both can give you the same conclusion, right? If the Fed lower the money supply, money multiplier will go up. Then the money supply will go up. Right, maybe I should. I'm not so sure you follow the intuition, so let me just add one more explanation here. If the reserve ratio is lowered by the Fed, then for the banks here will have more money to lend out, right? That is to say, banks here are able to make more loans than before. So money supply will go up. Then for the opposite, to lower the money supply in the economy, of course, the Fed just need to raise required reserve ratio, then everything just works in the opposite. So higher required reserve ratio, smaller money multiplier, then the money supply will go down. All right, then one more important thing here. For this policy instrument, reserve ratio, to adjust the reserve ratio in order to control money supply, this policy instrument is seldom used by the Fed. Why? Because by changing the reserve ratio, this regulation will affect the banking system. It's kind of a to borrow, we're borrowing for disturbing the banking system. So usually, the government would like the banking system to have a stable environment. Therefore, adjusting required reserve ratio, this policy instrument is rarely used by the Fed. However, you just know, in case the Fed for some reason the Fed wishes to adjust the required reserve ratio, you need to know how it works. Okay, and then the last policy instrument to control money supply is, all right, paying interest on reserves. Right, this is very interesting. You see, for the second policy instrument, we were talking about the regular banks can borrow money, borrow reserves from the Fed, and the regular banks need to pay interest to the Fed. That's the discount rate. And here, just the opposite. The banks here, regular banks here, can deposit reserves at the Fed. And then the Fed can pay interest on the reserves deposited by regular banks. Right, this is kind of new. These policies started in 2008. So you see, banks deposit their reserves at the Fed. Actually, here, this pay interest on reserves, the function here is very similar to the discount rate. Let's try to think. Where the higher the interest rate on reserves, right? If this is the situation. So banks here, regular banks here will try to deposit more reserves at the Fed. Then I can just go very quickly. More reserves to be held, then just try to think. In this way, fewer loans can be made. The money supply will go down. In other words, this means if the Fed raises the interest rate on reserves, banks will try to hold more excess reserves. Then fewer loans to be made. Their money supply will go down. Okay, that's one way to think about this higher interest rate on reserves. Or you can just follow what I have put on the slide. Based on the formula, okay, the reserve ratio here. If the Fed raised the interest rate on the reserves, then apparently the reserve ratio at the bank will go up. Then again, higher reserve ratio will cause smaller money multiplier than the smaller money supply. Okay, just again, two ways to think about this higher interest rate on reserves. Well, you see here, of course, the Fed, the central bank of the economy, can control the money supply through these four policy instruments. However, you see, all the control we discussed here is based on, you see, people no cash drain and no excess reserves. So no cash drain, this assumption goes for consumers, for just regular people. And for no excess reserves, here, this is for the regular banks. But in reality, let's see, for the households, regular people, they may want to hold more cash. Usually, you see, we don't deposit all currency at bank. If that is the case, here banks will have fewer reserves and fewer loans can be made. Therefore, money supply will go down. That's the effects from if we relax the assumption of no cash drain. How about the second assumption? If banks try to play safe, they want to hold more reserves than required. In other words, there will be excess reserve. If this is the case, then same situation as the first one. If banks hold more reserve, then fewer loans can be made, then money supply will go down. That is to say, for these two assumptions here, these will, when we relax these two assumptions, here the job of the Fed to control money supply will be more complicated in reality. However, we just assume the Fed can try to compensate for the behavior of households and banks, try to control the money supply in a very precise way. The Fed can provide a very precise control over the money supply. Even though the behavior of households and banks can complicate the job to control money supply. And you see, we have so many policy instruments. So the Fed can do a good job on controlling money supply. So that's for the job to control money supply, the Fed. And the last point I would like to discuss is, right, when we talk about the regular banks need to hold reserves. Why? Because facing this situation around bank runs, right? This happens when people lose faith in their banks. In other words, they don't trust their banks can pay their funds back. Therefore, people will run to the bank to withdraw their funds. You see, based on this fractional reserve banking system, banks don't hold the entire deposit as reserves. Therefore, if all depositors run to the bank to withdraw their funds, banks will not have enough currency to pay the depositors. If that happens, banks may have to close. Bankruptcy. You see here. Right, based on this, you see why I want to talk about this phenomena. Bank runs. If this happened, you see what? Let me just write down here. How these bank runs affect the economy. You see here. Basically, you can just try to think it as the opposite of the money creation process, because people here just withdraw all their deposits. So money supply will go down. The quantity of money, remember, money supply means the total quantity of money in the economy. If we had this bank runs in the economy, that means the money supply will go down. Then people will have this feeling that the cash at hand here is smaller and smaller. Then people will spend less and less. And also try to recall GDP of a country. The largest portion of GDP is consumption. So if people spend less and less, that means consumption will go down, then GDP will go down. Right? Most economists believe that this will cause the recession Ooh, okay. Let me see if recession. Of an economy. Right, again, here for this part, you see, it is very important to keep a stable environment for the banks in the economy, right? Otherwise, in case bank runs happened, then the consequence for the economy here is very severe. Here, recession, and even worse, we can have depression. And this discussion can also show how important the job in controlling money supply. So the central bank of the economy is very important. Right, so that's pretty much everything for this chapter. What left should be, again, we have many practice problem. Okay, let's go over these questions very quickly because for this part, again, straightforward. All right, which of the following lists two things that both decrease the money supply? Open market operation and reserve requirement. No, the question is asking about decrease money supply. Decrease the money supply, that means the Fed needs to take money from the public. So it should be open market sales and also raise the reserve requirement. In this way, fewer loans can be made, and here sales. This means we just take money from the public. Okay, just try to think. Therefore, the answer is C. For next one, right? Oh. Sure. Have questions? Yeah, you may. Oh. Yeah, sure. Good question, just as I explained. So this will affect the economy, I should say nationwide effect. That's why I mentioned when bank runs happen, then usually this economy will suffer from recession or depression. Okay. Then let's see the next question. What happens if the Fed raise the reserve requirement? Oh, sorry. Oh, what's wrong? I need to be gentle. All right. Reserve required ratio is higher than before. Then what happens? Well, a higher ratio will cause smaller money multiplier and lower money supply. So the answer is B. Okay, then the first two practice here are straightforward. Now let's try to see. It's getting more and more complicated. Let's see, the banking system here has $10 billion of reserves, right? None of which are excess reserves. And also people hold only deposits and no currency, no cash drain. And the reserve requirement is 10%. That's the basic information. And then the Fed raises the reserve requirement. The ratio goes up to 20%. And at the same time, you see the Fed are trying to use two policy instruments. They raise the required reserve ratio to 20% and also buys 1 billion of bonds. So based on these activities, how much does the money supply change? So let's look at for the first part. Here, 10 billion of reserves, none of which are excess. That is to say, let's think about from the T accounts for the bank. The reserves here, 10 billions. And we also know the initial required reserve ratio is 10%. Therefore, I can write down the deposits here. Must be equal to 100, right? Because of 10%. Then very quickly, I can write down the loans can be made here, should be 90, right? That's the T account. And then let's try to answer the question. None of which are excess. So that's just, I've already done this part, right? Initial deposits must be 100 billion. And then based on required reserve ratio, 10%, we know the reserves here is equal to 10 billion. Therefore, the initial, because the question here is asking the change in money supply. So we need to find the initial money supply here. Before the Fed employs the two instruments, here the initial money supply here should be equal to 100 deposit. Here the original deposit is 100 and the money multiplier is 10. So the initial money supply before any controlling policies. Here, the money supply is equal to 1,000 billion. And then, let's try to see. The required reserve ratio increases to 20% and the Fed buys 1 billion bonds. Now let's try to see. The new money multiplier here should be 1 over 20% is 5. And based on this new money multiplier, we will know, remember, greater required reserve ratio will cause smaller money supply. So money multiplier is only 5. And from the original deposits, 100 billion, we know, based on this new money multiplier, here we have money supply is now only 500 billion. And the second policy is the Fed buys government bond. Oh, here, that's my typo. It should be the Fed. Here, not the government. Right, the Fed here buys bonds, $1 billion bonds. That is to say the Fed pays 1 billion to the public. And the people hold only deposits. So based on this 1 billion, and together with, here, remember, we are now facing the new money multiplier, which is 5. So 1 billion times 5. So this 1 billion purchase government bonds will generate 1 billion money supply. Then you see the total money supply based on these two activities. We know the new money supply is equal to 501. Comparing it to the original money supply, 1,000. So money supply goes down from 1,000 to 501. So money supply drops by 495 billion. Okay, the key here is just remember, when required reserve ratio becomes 20%, the new money multiplier is only 5. So this is for this practice. And then again, let's see more practice problems for the controlling policies. Okay. All right. Now this is question number 7 from our textbook. So based on this open market operation, the Fed buys 10 million worth of government bonds. And the required reserve ratio is 10%. What are the largest and the smallest possible increases in the money supply that could result? Just try to explain. For me, this is a conceptual question rather than computational problem. So let's look at. Can buy $10 million government bonds. And we know the required reserve ratio is 10%. So the money multiplier should be equal to 10. 1 over R. Okay, the inverse of the required reserve ratio. So the maximum amount occurs when the two important assumptions: no excess reserves and no cash drain. So the maximum increase in money supply is 10 times 10 should be 100 million. And the smallest increase is just the other extreme. Banks here hold everything here as excess reserves. No loans are made. Therefore, here just 10. Sorry. Sorry. Because I hit the screen too hard. So I would like to. If this is the situation, all deposits here are held as reserves, then no loans are made. That is to say, actually, we don't have this money creation process. So the increase in money supply in this way is just 10 million. How about, let me ask you extension here. For part 2, it seems based on the explanation here, it just assumes people deposit all money, the entire $10 million at banks. So the question I'm raising here, what happens if people don't deposit this $10 million at banks? What happens to money supply if people hold this 10 million as cash? Ooh. What happens to money supply? Well, the answer should be same answer as here. The money supply will increase by just this $10 million. But based on this situation, it means everything will stay as cash. So here is 10, no deposit. So money supply will go up by 10 million. That's the smallest increase. Right? Either way, we can have the smallest increase in money supply. All right, so let's have our second break. So we can come back at 4:15. All right, let's look at this textbook problem. Number 11. I assume this reserve requirement is 20%. The ratio is 20%. And also assume that no excess reserves and no cash drain. Then the Fed decides that it wants to expand the money supply by $40 million. That means the Fed wishes to raise the money supply by 40 million. So part A, if the Fed is using open market operations, will it buy or sell bonds? And what quantity of bonds? The amount of bonds does the Fed need to buy or sell in order to achieve this, excuse me, to achieve this target? So let's see. This one is to raise the money supply, of course. The Fed needs to bring cash to the public's hand. Therefore, the Fed should buy government bonds. And for part B, how much bond to buy? Which is assuming using X to stand for the quantity, the amount of bonds the Fed needs to purchase. We know the reserve requirement ratio is 20%, so the money multiplier is equal to 5. Then what left? Straightforward, right? The policy target is to raise the money supply by 40 million, together with the required reserve ratio. We know the money multiplier is 5. So the Fed should purchase $8 million of government bond. Then the money supply will go up by 40 million. Of course, through money creation process. So here, and let's look at this. The problems with controlling money supply. The 100% reserve banking system in the US makes it difficult. Now, if we have 100% reserve banking system, then the banks cannot affect. If for part A, see. For option A, based on 100% reserve banking system, it means the banks cannot make any loans out of the deposit. Each dollar of the deposit will be held in the bank. So here, banks cannot affect money supply. Therefore, this will make the Fed's job to control policy easier because banks here no influence on the money supply, just regular people. So easier, let me put it here. Easier to control money supply. And B, the Fed has to get the approval of the US Treasury Department whenever it uses any of its monetary policy tools. This is the administrative process. And let's look at C. The Fed does not have a tool it can use to change the money supply. Of course, C is wrong. And for D, the Fed does not control the amount of money that households chose to hold. Yeah, so D is correct. Please relate to the assumption of no cash drain. So the answer is D. Okay. Then let's look at this. Maybe I've provided too many practice problems. And for this one, where we have this T account of this national bank. And the information here is based on these numbers. Here we know this national bank is holding 2% of its deposits as excess reserves. Now for part A, what is the reserve requirement? Of course, you have already seen the answer I have shown you here. Very quickly. So based on this, let me just use another color. Here, let me use blue. So how to find the reserve requirement? That is to say this $60,000 here, it includes 2% excess reserves. So the initial deposits here is 500,000. Times, or a required reserve ratio, R, and plus, this includes 2% excess reserves. Totally, we have the number, $60,000. Then you can do the calculation by yourselves. You see, here, R is equal to 10%. All right, then B. All right, based on this, okay, no excess reserves, assume no other banks holding excess reserves, and people here, no cash drain. How much does the money supply ultimately increase when this bank lends out its excess reserves? So for B, here lends out its excess reserves. So based on excess reserves, how much money supply will increase? So we need to find the amount of excess reserves first. So you can, excess reserves here should be equal to, here we have 500,000. We know the excess reserve is just 2%. Here should be $10,000. That's the amount of excess reserves. And we also know the money supply. here. The increasing money supply here. Okay. So the money multiplier here is 10 because the required reserve ratio is 10%. So the money supply should be 10. All right. Not very tricky. Just ask different items here. Now let's look at, a long question from our textbook. 10%, 100,000. There are totally 5 questions to answer in this question. Right, it begins with this hypothetical economy contains 2,000 $1 bills. So A, we start with the simplest case, right? People in this economy hold all money as currency, right? Then what is the money supply? Probably people deposit all money as deposits, and banks here maintain 100% reserves. What is the quantity of money? So A and B are two simplest cases. And for C, a little bit tricky now. People hold equal amount of currency and deposits. And again, banks maintain 100% reserves. Then in this case, what is the money supply? D and E, let me show you here. D, long question. Actually, the answer, in short, just try to find money supply in these 5 cases, right? D means, right, people hold all money as demand deposits, and the bank here, 100% reserve banking system. Again, what is the amount of money supply? And the last one, people hold equal amounts of currency and demand deposits. And again, no, here we need to be careful. For part E, not 100%, but 10%. Here again, D, 10%. Right now, let's begin with A. Just remember this economy, there are $2,000 in cash to begin with. So part A, everything is in the form of currency. Straightforward, right? Just C plus D. C is equal to 2,000. Everything is in cash. So money supply is equal to 2,000. And B, 100% reserve banking system. So whatever is deposited in banks will be reserved. So 0 cash, but everything stays as deposit in banks because 100% reserves. So $2,000, that's the money supply. 2 simplest cases, A and B. Now let's look at C. Equal amount of currency and deposits. Here, 100% reserves. And it seems a little bit complicated, but if you try to think it through, it means All right. For money supply, C plus D here, 1,000 because equal amount of currency and demand deposits. So currency 1,000 and deposit 1,000. And here for this 1,000 deposits, since banks here are holding the entire deposits as reserves, so no loans can be made. Therefore, here, no money creation process. So in this situation, 1,000 plus 1,000, again, the money supply is equal to 2,000 for part C. Then let's move on to part D. Here, the required reserve ratio now is 10%. And people deposit all money as deposits. Together with this reserve ratio, 10%, then we know the money multiplier is equal to 10. Therefore, here, the money supply here, deposits now is 2,000, okay, times the money multiplier. We know the money supply here will become $20,000. Okay, actually for the first 4 questions, straightforward. Just try to clarify the concepts. Then let's look at part E. You see, I just label it as the first part of E because based on the initial question in the textbook, right? You see, let's just read the question. People hold equal amounts of currency and demand deposits. For this sentence, it did not mention this situation is before or after the money creation process. So the reason why I separate part E into 2 parts is I'm trying to calculate the situation. Here, the first one is before this situation. Here, holding equal amounts of currency and deposits. This is before the money creation process. And later, for the second part, that's the situation after the money creation process. People are holding equal amount of money and equal amounts of currency and deposits after the money creation process. So let's look at the part 1. Before the money creation process, people are holding equal amounts of currency and deposits. And the required reserve ratio is 10%. Here. So let's try to do $1,000 in currency. C plus D. So we know currency is equal to 1,000. How about deposits? The initial deposits here is $1,000. But remember, we have this money creation process. The initial deposit here is 1,000 together with the money multiplier. We will know eventually the money supply after the creation process ends. The total money supply from the original 1,000 deposits will be $10,000 in money supply. Therefore, here, cash, currency, 1,000. And this is coming from initial deposit, which is 1,000. After the money creation process, there will be $10,000 for the money supply. Therefore, totally, in this case, the money supply will be equal to $11,000. Okay, then let's move on to the second part of part E. I've put down here. Try to clarify the situation. After the money creation process, people hold equal amounts of currency and deposits. Money multiplier here still 10. So here, because we don't know the initial deposit, right? What we know is after the money creation process, the deposit here will be equal to the currency at hand. So here, this part, okay, let me use. The bracket here shows you the initial deposit. Yeah, we have totally $2,000 minus the currency at hand. So this bracket shows you the initial deposits. And then the money multiplier is equal to 10. Then after the money creation process, this is the final deposit, D. And we know after the process, the final deposit here will be equal to the currency. So based on this thinking, you can do the calculation. You can find C, the currency held initially is equal to here, 1818.18. And apparently, based on this, you will know the deposit after the money creation process is also the same number. What about the money supply? Put them together, right? 36.36. So this is the situation when people hold equal amounts of currency and deposits after the money creation process. Right, so I think for this one, the difficult part, the tricky part, is you should be able to write down this equation. Then everything should be straightforward. Right, so this is for this practice problem. And then I guess we have one more. Okay, I'm trying to clarify some concept. Okay, please take 1 minute to read this question. All right, let's read the question together. You see the requirement here is which of the following can allow the bank to lend out an additional $10,000? The required reserve ratio is 10%. So let's see. For option A, the Fed buys a 10,000 bond from the bank. In other words, for this activity, the Fed gives the bank $10,000. And the second one here, and someone deposits $10,000 in the bank. Right, for this one, we have this 10% reserve requirement. So for the second activity, here, someone deposits $10,000 in the bank. The bank here needs to keep 10% of the deposit. For this one, sorry, that's wrong. All right, for the second activity, in part A, the bank needs to keep $1,000 as reserves. Therefore, here $9,000 can be made as loans. Therefore, A is not correct. However, before we look at the other options, I would like to look at the first activity in part A. If the Fed buys a $10,000 bond from the bank, remember I mentioned that this means the Fed just pays the bank $10,000 for this one because the cash here is coming from the Fed. In this situation, the bank's no need for the bank to keep reserves. Therefore, the bank can loan out the entire $10,000. Now you know the concept here, you will see. For B, all right, the first activity, just the same as the first one in part A, so you know. For part B, the first activity, sure. Okay, the bank can make an additional loan with the amount $10,000, right? And how about the second activity? Here in part B, the Fed lends the bank $10,000. Again, no need for the bank to keep reserves because the funds are coming from the Fed. So B seems to be correct. However, let's look at C and D. See, the Fed sells. Sells 10,000 bond to the bank. That means the Fed takes $10,000 from the bank. No way the bank can make an additional loans. And someone deposits 10,000, no. And D, right, same thing. The Fed sells a 10,000 bond to the bank, same thing. The money supply will actually decreases. And the Fed lends the bank $10,000. Of course, the second activity here, the bank can make an additional loan at $10,000. However, the first activity in part D, does not allow the bank to lend out this additional $10,000. Therefore, the answer for this question is B. All right, that's everything for chapter 29. Right, I'm too ambitious today. I thought I can still go over at least the first half of next chapter. That's why we uploaded the outline for chapter 30. But it seems we are almost running out of time today. So let me show you this. Right, the good news is today's lecture is the last lecture of this semester, right? And the bad news is, since this is the last lecture, we are going to have our final exam next week, right? Just the same as our midterm. Our final exam will be online and open book. So date just next Thursday, okay, 2:10 to 5:05. And here, apparently, here I need to cross out. I thought I can go over at least first half of chapter 30. But now so the final exam here, just these 3 chapters, 26, 28, and 29. And for me, I think just 26, not that straightforward, some analytical parts. But for 28 and 29, mostly straightforward. So I'm expecting you can do so well on our final exam. And just same thing as our midterm. There will be multiple choice question based on Google form and short answer questions will be posted on our new e-learning system. Okay, the same as before, please upload your answer, okay, through the e-learning website. And one thing I have to highlight here, it's different from last time is, right, during the exam, please try to log in the course link at least before you think you have completed the submission, but try to log in the course link to make sure, with me or Sandy to see if you really successfully submitted, right, all the answers, right? Other than that, all the procedure is the same as before, as our midterm. Okay, of course, we will try to post the procedure again on the e-learning system. And one more thing, here, how about the Thursday after our final exam, right? Just as usual, I will try to discuss some questions of our final exam, and also there will be an attendance check on that date. All right, so that's everything for today, so we can leave earlier. All right, thank you very much for your patience and cooperation today. Okay, so questions?
Yes, the professor is so it means there's no second quiz before the.
Oh yeah, no second quiz. I have posted the recording information on the e-learning website, so please remember to log in the e-learning system to see all the important information. Yeah, no quiz too.
Thank you.
All right. So any further questions? Of course, if you have any further questions, you can just email me or Sandy, right, to make sure you know all the information about our final exam. As I remember, the weights for our final exam is like 45 or something. Let me check. Sorry. Let me just recheck the information. Oh, 45. So the weights the weight on final exam is relatively big than before. So please, even though it is open book, please study hard. So because there are just 3 hours for the exam. So study hard makes it easier for you to find the answer during the exam. All right, if no further questions, that's everything for today. And thank you very much for your patience and cooperation this semester. I'm really hoping you can do so well on the final exam. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.